All right, today we have something much requested by the audience. We are going to be speaking with Vaush, not Vaush, not Vaosh, but Vaush, a popular streamer, debater, progressive socialist with nearly 300,000 subscribers. Now, I think it's important my audience understands that I don't call people socialists when they're not socialists. You're an actual bona fide socialist.
Yeah, I'd like to think I am at least.
Cool. All right. Well, we'll get into that. And now, what I'm always curious, anytime I deal with anybody who uses a pseudonym, how did you decide to operate under a pseudonym?
I was a big old art kid back in high school, you know? Every art kid wants to draw comics, or at least a lot of them do.
Okay.
Vosh was the name of a character that I wanted to draw. Anyway, when I started doing the content, I just decided to use it as a placeholder name, and it stuck. So, and it's catchy enough.
And I'm guessing for privacy reasons, it's not the worst thing.
Oh, sure, yeah. But, I mean, people go either way. But I think Vosh, it's nice and catchy anyway, so I don't mind.
So let's talk a little bit. I mean, maybe to get into our conversation, we are coming off the heels of an election in which Donald Trump lost, Joe Biden won. Senate control is unclear at this point, and we're sort of trying to figure out what is the next step. For someone with your perspective as a socialist, where both Joe Biden and Donald Trump are very different from you in terms of their politics, do you see replacing Trump with Biden as a good thing? How good of a thing?
Oh, undeniably. This is something that I learned when I looked into the writings of people like Engels and Lenin and Mao.
Yes.
You see, socialists are, at least as I understand it, most comfortable making our arguments in a democratic or a bourgeois democratic system. That is to say, in a system where we have sort of this veneer of corporate democracy where people expect things like rights and representation. You can make arguments like, hey, couldn't we be doing this better? In outright fascist societies, or societies which have become so nationalistic that national interest takes precedence over class interest, it's really difficult to get those arguments across. That's why we typically lose whenever fascists take power. We're the first ones out. We're the biggest threat. So preserving the system for a little bit longer under Joe Biden, vastly, vastly preferable to the threat of our democratic institutions crumbling. Also, just frankly, Biden's just better, like objectively, in a number of issues: climate change, healthcare. Can't argue with that.
So very clearly, you're making it obvious that you are not an accelerationist. Accelerationism being the idea that there would be a shortcut to your eventual ideal arrangement of affairs by having society crumble, by having those institutions crumble, that would in some way accelerate or more quickly get us to that endpoint. You very clearly don't subscribe to that.
The conditions need to be right for that. If things collapsed right now, we would not be the ones to take power. We do not have that kind of infrastructure established. They would be the ones to take power. In a system where it felt like chaos or collapse would be something which would inspire some kind of, natural, organic, democratic control, I could get behind that. But that is not the world we live in right now.
What would happen in your mind if things crumbled? Instead of a socialist utopia, what would we most likely see?
Oh, man. Depending on how things crumbled right now, the general prevailing attitude in this country is fear and nationalism. We would probably set up some sort of, if not one singular, at least a collection of ethno-nationalist communities. The direction this country is taking right now, the world is controlled, at least in chaos, by the most militarily prepared. And right now, I think a large number of Trump supporters are ready. They believe they're on the precipice of having to take hold of a dead world. Whereas a lot of progressive and left-leaning people, God bless them, whatever, I don't think are ready for that. And for that reason, if, push comes to shove, I'm just not confident in our chances. I think that we're going to go dramatically far right. I think we're probably going to turn into an isolationist, ethno-nationalist state. And from that point forward, we'll be completely unable to affect the rest of the world as its course changes. And I don't want that.
Yeah. Okay. So far, I completely agree with you. I think that if we do see a crumbling that some imagine might lead to the ushering in of the idealized socialist circumstances, I think we get exactly what you're talking about. Now, under what circumstances do you believe that your socialist organization of the country would be most likely to be achieved? What would happen between now and then leading up to it?
We need to do a lot of cultural work, and we need to get people to fixate on issues that actually affect their lives. What gets a Trump supporter out of bed? What gets them angry at the world? Is it the state of their schools, their infrastructure, their education, their healthcare? Very rarely, no. Usually it's meaningless cultural issues. You have trans people, you have the belief that BLM is going to burn down their suburb. These are nonsense, scaremonger, fear issues. These aren't reflective of reality. And for that reason, this is why we are concern ourselves with the spread of something called class consciousness. We want people to be concerned first and foremost with the conditions that actually affect their lives. And if we can do that, and I believe we can do that, and people like Bernie Sanders have shown you can do that to lots of people if you focus on the right arguments. I think that we'll be in a position where the predominant ideological trend of this country will be one towards radical workplace democracy, as opposed to radical isolationism, radical ethnic exclusionary behavior, that sort of thing.
Am I being too simplistic if I say that for the time being, socialists and social democrats should be united because the next steps are identical for both groups, or at least they should be?
No, I think that's totally true. I mean, we'll backstab each other later, I'm sure,
Right.
historically. Yeah, of course, of course. But for right now, yeah, we need to focus on social democrats. You consider yourself one, of course.
I do.
I know you are.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I've seen your content. Social democrats and socialists have a lot in common in that we both respect the belief that the economic resources of our country should be turned towards the well-being of the people. We should focus on improving these base institutional needs that we believe humans are entitled to. And that's great. And I think that when people are exposed to that, they're way less likely to associate their well-being with these meaningless cultural platitudes that Trump supporters or other culture warriors like to obsess over. For now, I think our interests are aligned. Down the line, we'll have our arguments, I'm sure.
So now let's think ahead a little bit. If we just to really kind of continue exploring your worldview, imagine that the social democrats get the things they want. We have democratization of the workplace. We are sort of raising the floor and putting some ceiling in and making sure nobody falls too far and doing some of the things Finland and other Northern European places have done. Social democrats get their way. Okay. Mm-hmm. Once you get to that point, what mechanism do you imagine would usher in socialism? How do we get to where every business, for example, socializes ownership of the means of production? By what mechanism is that installed or enacted?
Well, you mentioned workplace democracy, which I like. I think that's a very good Trojan horse for socialist ideals because it literally is the seizure of the means of production. In a society in which every workplace is democratic, that is to say, there's some kind of democratic framework that allows you to vote in or vote out individuals, managers, that sort of thing.
Sure.
And the means of those firms, the wealth, the resources, are collectively owned amongst those who work there. If you have every firm in a country that adheres to those principles, you have what would have been called 150 years ago a dictatorship of the proletariat. Not very well named, but essentially, because dictatorship didn't have the connotation back then that it does now, a workers' state. And
well, let's pause for a second, though. Sure. Maybe we might have a different idea of in fact, it's very clear we have a different idea about what democratization of the workplace would mean. So when I think about democratization of the workplace, I'm talking about for companies above a certain size, you must have board representation from employees. When so there's a list of things, but I think it's probably, it certainly doesn't sound like it would go as far as what you're talking about, which sounds like it would almost be a socialization of the means of production.
That would be the goal for me, at least. I think that democratically minded people are very susceptible to arguments in favor of the democratization of the workplace in the way that I describe it.
Yes.
I think that once you look at a firm and you look at its traditional organization, which is pretty dictatorial in its natural state, here in the States, you don't control who your manager is or who your boss is. You work there and you do what you're told or you're fired. I think that people are very amicable to the idea that there can be an improvement on that system. There's very, very positive data coming out of countries, all around the world in different material conditions, suggesting that worker cooperatives are a pretty effective way of organizing firms, and it leaves people happier. And in some cases, it's even more efficient. So the question is, how can we sell people on the idea that that system, which necessitates the destruction of the bourgeois, the class, you no longer have an owner, after all, it's collective. How do we incentivize that? How do we encourage people to move in that direction?
But is your view, so there's a dramatic difference between everybody is convinced and sold on the idea that that's how businesses should be owned versus it is imposed as this is how it must be done, or otherwise it is not a legal business. It sounds like you're leaning, at least for now, more in the direction of saying you feel like you have the facts on your side and you could convince people to do it that way. Are you not suggesting that at a certain point, the only legal way to organize a business would be socialized ownership?
I don't think you can compel democracy. I don't think it works very well. I think that when socialism arrives in the States, should it arrive, nobody will call it socialism. They will view it as a natural extension of a series of economic and worker-related rights that they've been building upon for a good time before that. With regards to whether or not this should be pushed for in like an autocratic way, though an autocratic sort of delivery of democracy is a little silly, but it's happened before.
Yes.
When we freed the slaves, of course, the slave owners didn't like that, but we did it anyway, and I think we can agree that was a good thing. The people who will be pushing back on this aren't going to be the democratic populace. It's probably going to be the owners of these businesses, and that's the ultimate conflict. You know, how significantly can the interests of the majority be assigned precedence over the interests of a very small, very elite group of landed modern aristocrats?
We're going to continue our conversation with Vaush, and the full interview will be posted on the YouTube channel. But on the podcast, TV, and radio show, we are going to go to a break. What I find so interesting about this is that there are some socialists who will email me or leave me voicemails that essentially defend the government imposition of socializing ownership of businesses as not being such an imposition, as not being autocratic or authoritarian. What I'm hearing you say more is that you simply don't think that that's the right approach, and that you could win essentially, I hate to use such a silly term, but the battle of ideas and convince people that this is the way to go.
I would hope so. I mean, with like take for example OSHA, work and safety. When this was imposed, there was quite a bit of pushback from, business leaders and lobbyists and what have you. They didn't want these impositions. They don't want the government interfering with this sort of thing. But generally speaking, now in hindsight, I think we can reflect on that and think like, it was probably okay. Are there going to be some people whose feathers are ruffled by any imposition whatsoever of like a democratic standard in the workplace? Undeniable. But you want to minimize that because as it stands, the bourgeois, the landed elite, they have a tremendous amount of cultural and media influence. And the more they push back against this, the more the proletariat, the workers, are going to believe it's not in their interest either. It's in my interest to sell this to people as effectively and as ideologically as possible, because then if we do come to not blows, but come to terms with it, I would much rather have a vast, vast majority of the population against a group of lobbyists and maybe 5% of people who think it's in their best interest that corporations remain autocratic than a culture war between socialists and capitalists. I think that we're much better off selling it to people that way.
I want to get to some more of that. When Donald Trump has said a number of times now, this will never be a socialist country, I'm quick to point out the sort of silliness of being able to say that something will never happen. We just don't know that. Things that would be unimaginable tend to happen relatively quickly in history. I think it's a silly thing to say in principle. I also think it's silly because there are essentially no actual socialists in any positions of power in the United States, so that the risk of socialism anytime soon seems very small. I'm glad for you to fact check me on those two things. But my question was more about time frame. How long, in your mind, would the transition you would like to see take realistically? I know if you convince everybody tomorrow, it could happen quickly, but understanding the world that we live in, the country we live in, is this a 10-year project? Is this a 50-year project?
The problem is, I don't think people understand the extent to which they're again, the socialist framework. I don't think most people in this country understand the extent to which the wealthy are behind a lot of the underlying infrastructural systemic issues we have. If you look at anything from media to education to healthcare, any of these things that really impact people's lives, if you dig deep enough, eventually at the root of it, you get, I mean, it sounds simplistic, but a collection of greedy people who have landed interests, who work in in their own interest, and you can't do anything about it because they're powerful and you're not. And I think that we get distracted by this with all these culture war issues. And right now we are more distracted, I think, than we ever have been. We are obsessed with this idea that the heart and soul of this country is being fought over by either Antifa or by like Patriot Prayer, like militia groups, when in reality, underneath all of that, and of course I side with BLM in every conceivable cultural manner, but underneath that, these two groups fighting, they share a common enemy. I don't think there's much class consciousness in this country right now. What
But
I would
given all
hope,
of that, what is the timeline?
I'm right. I don't think there's any realistic possibility of this timeline being accelerated until the consequences of climate change exacerbates the American people's negative attitudes towards the people who got us in this position. If the country is really being battered down, like people are losing their lives, entire cities are being flooded or typhooned, I think at that point there's a very real chance that the collective animosity against the people, the Exxon executives who lied about data, the government officials who covered it up, that might be a boiling point. But at the moment, it's a slow, steady battle where we will have very little relative influence compared to the fascists.
So in terms of, you mentioned the cultural issues. I want to talk about this a little bit. My view on political correctness is that it's a perfectly reasonable thing to criticize, but I'm not going to be using it as a dog whistle for conservatism, nationalism, fascism, or any of that stuff. My view about so-called identity politics is I don't want identity used as a cudgel to silence people, but we should understand that one's identity can bring perspectives to the table that are valuable and unique, and that should be welcome. So, I kind of have this view that all of these culture type issues, speech type issues that the right likes to talk about, there's like 2% about it that resonates with me, and 98% where they're misusing it and exaggerating it and using it to suppress speech they don't like, etc. Where are you on those types of issues?
Oh, it's completely. I mean, I'm very much in favor of intersectional analysis. I graduated with a degree in sociology. I would have to be if I wanted to pay any respect to my major. Let's face it. When conservatives talk about issues like cancel culture or like political correctness or like identity politics, they genuinely are using this as sort of a broader dog whistle against like progressivism as a concept.
Right.
Because where the right uses identity politics religiously when they can get away with it. The right uses cancel culture, whatever the hell that means these days, religiously when they can get away with it. I don't think they're attacking these issues in good faith. And I think the thought leaders who are pushing these narratives are in many cases being paid to do so, because the longer they can keep their fan bases obsessed with these misunderstandings of issues that aren't even real issues, the less time they have to understand how hard they're being taken for by these thought leaders, by the people who pay them.
You've debated a ton of these people, and some of them I've also debated. I think you do a far better job than I do. You've been on with Jesse Lee Peterson. You've been on with Tim Pool. I think I've done okay with these guys. Just want to say, by the way,
your JLP conversation, phenomenal. Really
enjoyed
that.
Thank you.
The recent one, yeah.
No, but in all seriousness, I actually am curious. I mean, you have a facility with. Where I struggle sometimes is I'm identifying where their argument is nonsense, but I have less facility to, in a pithy way, exposing why their argument is nonsense. And I'm sort of dancing around and that type of thing. What has been your sort of like training and how do you prepare for these things? Is it simply reading about the subject matter? Do you research the people you'll be debating? How does it work?
I try to prepare as little as possible because what I find is that these debates very rarely end up being nuanced discussions of policy or history, and usually end up being a show of force. Usually these online conservative thought leaders, whatever, fascists, wherever they land on the spectrum, they're the people who follow them because they think they're an intellectual titan. They're respected as some sort of, strong, grandiose SJW crusher. And I think that generally speaking, what these arguments come down to is who can insult the other person as effectively and viciously as possible while making them feel like a fool. When it comes to like actual nuanced discussion of issues, honestly, I just feel like they don't pay enough respect to the issues they're deigning to talk about for it to even be worth my time to do any kind of special investment. So it's really,
these are rhetorical battles, not substantive battles.
Oh, yeah. I've had maybe 2 or 3 substantive arguments out of hundreds of rhetorical debates. Well, what I've found is, I mean, when you boil it down, all political engagement is rhetoric at the end of the day. Very few people care about policy. So what I've found is finding that line between people it's good to be mean to and people it's good to be nice to. And that's been more difficult than any other distinction I've had to make with my debate opponents. And I'm trying to get better about that. Some people, you look way better if you're kind and quiet and sort of, not submissive, but,
not aloof.
Right, receptive. And with some people, you really just have to tear them down. And I think that it's honestly quite fun to find out what you can get away with in both of those situations. And I quite like being able to do it for a living.
Now, the question that I think all of us at some point have, and I've had these phases, like I used to have right-wingers on my show all the time and debate them, like in the early years of the show, the homophobes, the supply-siders, you name it, right? Whatever. And then I had periods where I stopped doing it because it wasn't so much that I got bored, but I realized maybe what you've realized, which is we're not really talking about policy. These are really performances to a certain degree. And I kind of just go back and forth about it. Is it enough to say this is entertaining for the audience and I can make somebody look like their ideas are wrong, even if we don't actually do anything substantive? Is that not enough? I just kind of go back and forth about what the value and the value proposition is.
Yeah, my community is full of former alt-righters and conservatives who have been pulled over, if not just by me, then at the very least by other people, some by you. You've been mentioned quite a few times. And I think that for me, frankly, I'm an advocate. I don't care what I have to do to get people on board with socialism. If I had to juggle pies and smash my face into one of them every once in a while, and I felt that would somehow in some way convince people, I would go for that route. I feel that the entertainment element is essential. This is one of the ways the lefties lost the online space.
Right.
Lefty online engagement politically is very measured. You've seen the video essays, I'm sure, very measured, very artistic. Conservatives will throw up meme compilations 3 times a day. They'll do SJW. They'll go to a women's rights rally and just make like blubbering noises in the face of like activists. They don't care, and they find it delightful, and they get lots and lots of engagement. And while I don't necessarily want to sink to that level and don't think I could, because I think my arguments are a little less juvenile than those, I think that at the end of the day, people gravitate towards things they find fun. So we have to be able to nail that for them. How do you make being a socialist or a progressive or, God, not a fascist fun?
Yeah, there's this guy, I don't even know if he still makes content, to be honest. His name is Carl Benjamin. He's a British guy. I think at one point he was operating under the name Sargon of Akkad, and he once confronted me for using so-called clickbait YouTube titles. And when we got down to it, I said, I'm coming up with titles to encourage people to watch the content, because I think that's what I want them to do. And as long as these titles are not deceptive, I'm not really sure I even understand what the argument is. And it's that type of you're sort of buying the way I see it is I'm using an interesting title or covering a cartoonish Trump rally to get people in the universe to then hopefully come back for the tax analysis and the discussion of policy and so on and so forth. I don't think that there's anything wrong with that. I just wish the left were better at it.
Yeah, absolutely. And they are so much better at it than us. Take Steve Bannon, for example, targeting like young incel gamer communities online and deliberately trying to pull them into the alt-right. They are ruthless about trying to grab any community they can. But I feel like they're very hypocritical when they criticize us likewise. That same man, Carl, you just described, has said publicly that he will not debate me after 2 debates with me where he didn't do great. Because I make money from the debates that I do.
Doesn't he make money?
He does make money from the debates he does. Yeah, that's his argument.
Is the argument that because you're a socialist, you shouldn't make money?
That is definitely one component of the argument. Socialism is when you don't make money for the work you do.
That's
apparently
weird. Yeah, I mean, at Politicon a couple years ago, there was this surreal moment where I'm trying to remember, Hassan Piker was on stage debating, I think, Charlie Kirk. And at a certain point, something crazy happened where Cenk Uygur from the audience yelled something, and Charlie Kirk made a similar argument about how
I live like a capitalist every day.
He can make money because he's a capitalist. And why is Cenk? But it's like Cenk's also a capitalist. He's just not. He's just not a fascist. He's a social democrat or whatever Cenk considers him to be.
Also, socialists are all about keeping the fruit of your labor. The idea of socialism, meaning that you can't keep the fruit of your labor, is ridiculous.
Right. In other words, if you're generating, I hate to go into the labor theory of value, but if you're generating value from this debate by getting I, as a social democrat, believe you should be compensated in proportion with the value you generated.
Yeah, no, completely. I think, and it all gets really weird. It all gets really fussy, especially with online content, because the lines between like a worker and owner blur a little bit.
They
I think
do.
that there's a lot of really nuanced discussion that you can have on this. But when people like Carl are saying like, "Oh, well, you make money from this, so I won't deign to debate you," when you get to that level, like I think it's pretty clear that you're trying to find excuses. I think people like him and other people on the right online are terrified of people like myself and of you, because I think that we're catching up. We're trying to establish a much more substantive, progressive, and sometimes socialist front on this website, and we're doing it better than they were able to a couple years ago when they had the front foot. You know?
Now, as far as your operation, is it just you, or do you have, as some might call them, colleagues? Some might call them employees, or is it a solo shop for now?
I have two people predominantly who help me. I have a content manager who helps manage some of my social media, and I have a website manager who manages the website that I stream on. Both of them are compensated a percentage, and they're given complete creative freedom of their work. So I try my best to live to the standard that I set, and I would like to believe that I, compensate very generously. But as I do better in the future, I would look to even raise their pay, because I could not have done this by myself.
So it's not you guys are three-way partners in this, and you've completely socialized the profit centers.
No, for smaller industries, or not industries even, for smaller firms like this one, like a YouTube channel,
Yes.
there's such an asymmetrical distribution of responsibility that it's
Yes.
difficult to. Right, right. That's one of the issues, which is why that with regards to worker cooperatives, I can understand arguments for traditional firm ownership for really small businesses, especially in media or heavily specialized industries where essentially the other people are acting as assistants to one person's like unique talent with regards to whatever it is they're doing.
Wow.
But it's an ongoing process, and I'm interested in seeing more content creators online explore similar models.
Very interesting. Yeah, no, I think that certainly one of the difficulties in terms of talking about democratization of the workplace is businesses that are relatively small. And by relatively small, I mean even, like 8 employees, 10 employees, I still consider to be relatively small. You might, that's more employees than I have, but you might sort of draw the line at a different place. To kind of wrap up our conversation. So
Mhm.
next 2 months, do you have any doubt that Joe Biden is inaugurated as president? What do you most want to see him do? What are you most worried he will do?
Um, with regards to Joe Biden, as much as I've looked over it, I can't think of a single Supreme Court action. I can't think of any avenue the Trump administration has to legitimately overturn the president-elect's victory. It would
Yes.
have to be, maybe there's some incredibly obsequious 250-year-old statute that they can interpret. I have no idea, but I imagine that with all the fussing and whining we're seeing, it's going to end up exactly how we expect it to, which is very embarrassingly for Trump.
I agree.
Um, with regards to the best and worst things that we're going to see, unfortunately, there's not much of a standard that I can set for Joe Biden's performance, because it looks like we're not going to be able to take the Senate. If doesn't have the Senate, there's a lot of stuff that I would like to see that I can't even expect he would be able to do. He does have a plan for one first day executive actions, which I'm looking forward to seeing. But
Yeah.
I guess my overall worry, my main worry, is that there are certain elements within the Democratic Party that are going to attempt to blame the progressive wing for their performance in this past election. AOC has already taken a lot of fire for this from from certain people. I don't want to get into it too much, but that would be very disappointing to me. Um, for the thing that I'm looking forward to the most, frankly, I want to go back to bashing liberals. It's exhausting all the time arguing with fascists. They are so dumb. I want to advance the state of class consciousness amongst people who I think are just at the cusp of it.
Hmm.
Progressive liberals. I think that if you make good arguments to these people, they can move over. But like arguing fascists, it's like herding cats. I look forward to challenging systems in power that are reasonable again, or at least more standard.
That's I mean that's we agree. We definitely are agreeing on more than I imagined. Maybe this is the where we could end it. Do you think an open-faced omelet is a pizza? Where do you come down on that?
I am a culinary and linguistic descriptivist. I think that if you want to call it a pizza, you have to, and I will respect your right to do so.
So an open-faced omelet, you're fine calling a pizza.
Absolutely, I am
Wow.
100%. Yeah.
That's huge. That's huge. And if you put a tortilla under it, then it's absolutely a pizza, right?
I mean that nails it home. Not that it
Yeah.
needed that affirmation, but if you
Sure.
go that far, and you can wrap that around much as you want. Pop tart, a burrito, absolutely, I'll take it.
Wait, a Pop-Tart is a pizza now?
No, Pop-Tart's a burrito.
Oh,
It's
I'm sorry. Oh, okay, okay.
right,
That's
filling
actually that's
enclosed
that
around.
I've not thought of. That I've not thought of. But we will. Wow, that now my mind is blown. I'm gonna have to think about that one a little bit.
Getting hungry over here. Oof.
Okay. Well, listen, we've been speaking with Vaush, who now is ready to crest 300,000 subscribers on YouTube, is a streamer, debater, progressive socialist, not yet completely socialized in terms of the means of production within his organization, but presented a very good argument as to why he is not. And I can't thank you enough. I'm so glad we were able to do this.
Yeah, likewise. I hope we're able to speak again in the future, hopefully under slightly less tumultuous circumstances.
Completely and totally agree.